Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her husband Paul Pelosi have reportedly exercised options worth millions of dollars in Apple and Microsoft stocks a day before they would have expired, according to Apple Insider. The husband and wife purchased 5,000 shares in Apple and Microsoft stock per day before the option expired, and this equals approximately $930,000 worth of Apple stock and $1.7 million worth of Microsoft stock.
Journalist Glenn Greenwald tweeted yesterday, "The queen of congressional stock trading today went on the MSNBC program of state propagandist Jen Psaki to sermonize about the importance of integrity in public servants." Let's take a listen to what she had to say about this relating to SCOTUS justices.
If nothing else, there should be some ethical rules that would be followed. I had one justice tell me he thought the other justices were people of integrity, like a Clarence Thomas. I'm like, get out of here.
And here's what the then Speaker had to say about members of Congress trading stocks a year ago.
No, I don't know to the second one. We have a responsibility to report in the stock. On the stock, but I'm not familiar with that 5-month review, but if people aren't reporting, they should be. Yeah. Because this is a free market and we are a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that. Yes, ma'am.
Right. So, again, people should be able, I agree that people should be able to participate in a free market economy. But should the people who write the rules for the stock companies also be directly participating, who are crafting legislation around important tech issues? Her and her husband, or just her husband, but it is her husband, investors in companies like Facebook and NVIDIA, I never know how to say that, at the same time as the CHIPS Act going through. These are massive amounts of money at stake that they're directly tied into.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is not a controversial issue. There is a bipartisan effort to ban congressional stock trading, which is part of why that Nancy Pelosi clip from last year was so galling and went so viral. She was asked a clear, direct question about whether or not Congress members should be allowed to trade stocks. And also, the reporter had set up the fact that many Congress members had violated the existing rules on trading and disclosures. And her answer was to kind of scoff at it and be really dismissive of the idea that there could be anything untoward. Now, in her mild defense here, there's no specific allegation that there's some connection between her behavior in office and this particular stock trade, but it's a much broader issue than that. And I think that Glenn is right to point out the hypocrisy of folks who are hand-wringing and moralizing in one instance, but are unwilling to hold themselves to those same sorts of standards. Now, it is also true that what Nancy Pelosi is saying about the level of corruption in the Supreme Court is accurate and true. Federal employees are broadly required to report gifts, and that includes Supreme Court justices. And of course, you just recently had this scandal involving Clarence Thomas, and now this more recent scandal involving Samuel Alito, who was revealed to have taken a personal jet flight with a billionaire who had a very significant case before the court. There are federal reporting rules that would have required him to report. He has reported in the past $500 worth of food and gifts, but not this much more significant gift, a plane ride and a fishing trip with this billionaire who had this case before the court. And what was so scandalous about this particular event was that ProPublica had reached out to Alito and to get some questions answered in furtherance of writing this story. And instead of responding to the questions, he was allowed to write an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal defending himself. But he didn't defend himself by saying, I didn't violate the rules of the Supreme Court. He didn't make any references to any of the disclosure rules in the Supreme Court. He cited definitions of words and basically said, I think that I'm an ethical guy, don't worry about it. So it seems very much like there's just a big club and regular people aren't in it or held by those same sorts of standards.
Sure. So I guess further in his defense, he says that they didn't discuss this case, that in fact he had no idea that Singer was involved in any of these cases that tangentially concern his business interests.
Right. Well, the rule is you have to disclose gifts, not that you have to disclose gifts when you think that the person is before the court, as he's done in the past. In fact, the ProPublica piece that eventually came out made it clear that Alito has disclosed this $500 gift, saying also, I don't think this person is going to come before the court. So Alito seems to have an awareness that the condition of disclosure isn't believing that they're going to appear before the court. And this was a much more significant gift. So this was a luxury fishing lodge that charged more than $1,000 a day. The private jet that he flew on to Alaska, where this trip took place, would have cost more than $100,000 one way had Alito chartered it himself. And part of Alito's defense was, well, if I didn't get on this plane, the seat would have been empty anyway, so the cost wasn't a real cost that accrued. And that's up to the public to decide if they think that they have faith in the federal judiciary accepting those kinds of gifts, which led to the person who scheduled the trip winning $2.4 billion before the Supreme Court when the case was resolved in his favor.
Right. He says, again, I'm looking at Alito's op-ed. He says that when I joined the court and until the recent amendment of the filing instructions, justices commonly interpreted this discussion of hospitality to mean that accommodations and transportation for social events were not reportable gifts. So.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, on one hand, you're going to dinner with someone and you're saying, well, I got to report $500 worth of dinner costs. That seems like hospitality. On the other hand, a fishing trip where you're being put up for $1,000 a day plus $100,000 plus plane ride isn't disclosed, I think, in a lot of people's eyes, if you were able to take the lens of partisanship out of it. If it's not a big deal, then why not just disclose it? And especially given that there's been these now repeated high-profile instances of these kinds of scandals, it would be even, I think, somehow satisfying or grounding, or if they retrospectively said, well, let me report some of these things because I can see now that it's in the public interest as a consequence of the Harlan Crow, Clarence Thomas fiasco.
I think the argument that he's making, or that people are making on his behalf, is that he genuinely didn't know that he had to report this. And in fact, he disclosed this informally in a social setting. He gave a speech to the Federalist Society where he told an anecdote from this trip with Paul Singer, this fishing trip where they got surrounded by bears or something. So it wasn't being attempted to be kept secret.
Yeah, but that's the problem.
Argument.
I think the problem with that, and the ProPublica piece points this out, is why did you disclose this other gift if you didn't think disclosures were necessary? So for background, a federal law passed after Watergate requires federal officials, including Supreme Court justices, to publicly report most gifts. So the year before, this is from ProPublica, Alito reported getting $500 of Italian food and wine from a friend, noting that his friend was unlikely to appear before this court. Now, the law has a personal hospitality exemption if someone hosts a justice on their own property. Free food, lodging, or entertainment don't always have to be disclosed, but the law clearly requires disclosure for gifts of private jet flights, according to 7 ethics law experts, and Alito appears to have violated that rule.
Sounds kind of confusing, frankly.
All right, well, then that same excuse could be given in defense of Nancy Pelosi and others who trade these kind of stocks. And I think if we're going to be principled here, this cannot be a partisan endeavor where folks are willing to look one way if they happen to be affiliated with the right, or look one way if they happen to be affiliated with the left. I'm sitting here saying I think it's unconscionable that Nancy Pelosi has, when she was Speaker of the House, declined to bring these kind of stock bills to vote because they obviously, she perceived them, it seemed, to be as disadvantaged to her own personal interest. Jen Psaki sitting here as a former spokesperson for the head of the Democratic Party, failing to press Nancy Pelosi on those kinds of ethics questions is unethical. And I think it's also the case that Supreme Court justices, whether they be left or right-leaning, not following the federal disclosure rules that came out of the most famous instance, perhaps, of political corruption, the Watergate scandal, is a real detriment to American society. Are these cases that are providing billions of dollars of outcome to billionaires really in the public interest, or is this a kind of corporate cronyism that none of us should be content with?
I just don't really think it's affecting his in the same way that I don't care that Elena Kagan recently drew a salary from Harvard and is weighing in as we speak on the Harvard admissions case.
You don't care about that? You don't think there's a conflict of interest there?
No, I don't think it affects her decision making.
I don't know that I agree with that. I don't know that if it doesn't, why not just, one, she's made the disclosure, so that's helpful, but also, why not recuse herself and or forgo that salary? If things are this important and the optics are so important in the outcome of these kinds of cases, the credibility of the court is, of course, implicated if one of the justices was, obviously she was my law school dean when I was there, but also that she is still drawing a salary is an obvious conflict of interest. Not every conflict of interest necessarily affect someone's decision making, but it's the optics of what's going on there that is causing there to be public mistrust in these institutions, and that matters.
I mean, it just seems like for the Supreme Court, there'd be no end to that. I mean, Ketanji Brown Jackson was appointed by Biden, so should she not weigh in on any Biden-related case? Of course not. That would be, I mean, you could say that about any of them, right? It seems that to me, it's fundamentally different from, and not, I take your point that it shouldn't just be like a partisan thing against Nancy Pelosi. There's tons of people in Congress, including many Republicans, high-profile Republicans, the Georgia Republicans, who got caught and humiliated as they deserve to be for the insider trading they were doing with respect to COVID. So I'm not at all trying to make it just like a Democratic issue. It's not at all. There are tons of Republicans in Congress. But to me, it's a more direct. The corruption is more obvious. It involves them getting millions of dollars instead of what's being maligned about the Supreme Court is a bunch of kind of collegial relations around influential people.
Well, I don't know. I don't have collegial relations with Alito. Don't have the ability to sit down with him and share my view of the world. And millions of working class people around America are also not being invited on these $1,000 a day fishing trips and having apparently no influence at all on sharing their life, their concerns, their priorities, and how they see the world. So if you think that it's equitable that very affluent people can get proximity to folks that are making decisions at the highest level in the United States of America, I mean, that's one person, that's a point of view that people can have. But I will say I think there's a real distinction between appointments and providing financial incentives. Do I think that I'm very open, by the way, to the idea that Supreme Court justices should be decided by some metric other than being appointed by the sitting president. That's one of the conversations that's been percolating around Supreme Court reform, and I'm very open to that, generally speaking. However, the whole point of lifetime tenure, again, I'm open to changing that, but the whole point of lifetime tenure is that the appointment no longer necessarily has the long arm of effect on your behavior. And we have seen over the course of the Supreme Court, many justices that were reported by conservatives become more liberal over their period of time in the court. And there's nothing that the appointing president can do about it because of the reality of lifetime tenure. So I do think that's a very different thing than someone who is continue to recoup monetary benefits from an institution that is literally before them in the court.
Yeah. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.